everybody see and hear me? Okay, cool. Just as another reminder, I take POIs in the chat, so thank you. The problem in the status quo is that there is an inescapable narrative equating the length of the marriage with the quality of the marriage. On side proposition, instead of celebrating a marriage just because it lasted for an unhappy 50 years, we want to celebrate marriages that last however long they do, but ones that are happy and satisfying and fulfilling for the people in them. And for that reason, I'm very, very proud to propose. What is the context of this debate? There are two things to note. First, marriage in the status quo is seen as a lifelong commitment. The reason why this is true is because marriage was something that was originated within religion and religious ideas. It is originated from the idea that people are bound to be together, that they are soulmates, that the concept of the family is something sacred, etc. These religious ideas about marriage have also seeped into secular thought because much of secular tradition is also based on certain values coming from religion. Our essential stance in this debate is that we oppose this idea that marriage should be a lifelong commitment, and because of this opposition, we would rather have a system of marriage where it automatically expires in 10 years and must be renewed in order to continue. Secondly, then, what exactly do these marriage contracts look like on our side of the house? Three things to note. A, we say they expire in 10 years and you have a chance to renew them. B, if these contracts are not actively renewed by both couples by going to the courts in order to renew them, they automatically expire. This is different from getting a divorce in the status quo, since a divorce is an active choice to breach a promise instead of simply allowing a contract bound to expire run its course. This is analogous to, for example, in workplaces, a person with a 2-year work contract choosing to break the contract and leave after their first year, aka getting a divorce, versus a person with a 1-year contract leaving after their work is over and their contract expires. C, if you want a divorce before the time is up on our side of the house, we still let the usual status quo run its course. You divorce as usual, you go to courts, you find the reason why you're divorcing. Given that, two arguments in the speech. First, why it is better for the interpersonal relationship, and second, why our system is also better for women. Firstly then, on the interpersonal relationship. People in the status quo enter into a lifelong commitment when they decide to enter marriage. But this is problematic for the simple reason that people change. They change in one of two ways. A, they change because of human nature. You change automatically and naturally because of life experiences, and your tastes and preferences also change along with that. People naturally grow older and decide that they want to change themselves and change the way they present themselves and change the way they act and change who they like. The person you decided you were in love with at 25 is not going to be the same person 20 years later when you are 45, and you will also not be the same person 20 years later when you are 45. But B, all relationships have a honeymoon phase where for the first 2 years you are married, and at the moment when you're deciding to enter into a marriage, you're always going to be very giddy off of the proposal. You're also always going to be super happy because you are in love. But later on, as you enter into the marriage and you continue with it, you begin to see and notice the monotonies of life. And as that happens, people tend to fall out of love. They tend to be no longer as passionate about the relationships that they originally entered into. What all of this implies is two things. First, as such, it is impossible for you to decide 20 years before your marriage truly runs its course at that point in time that you are okay sharing your life, your financial assets, and everything else in between with a person. We say that you cannot meaningfully consent into a lifelong commitment. But secondly, it also means that divorce should be normalized because it is the natural circumstances of people changing. Because of human nature, divorce should be something that is accepted and something that everybody goes through in their lives. What changes on our side of the house when we enact this policy where a marriage automatically expires after 10 years? 5 things happen. First, in and of itself, our side allows the contract of marriage at the point at which you enter them to be far more realistic, as you are now consenting into marriage with the person that you fell in love with and are going to be continued to be in love with probably for the next 10 years before you start beginning to change and going on different courses in your life. And as such, we make the concept of marriage marriage itself far more realistic. But secondly, people on our side of the house also make better decisions within their marriage. In their initial years of marriage, people understand that it is normal and expected for them to fall apart in 10 years because that is literally the state policy that they enter and consent into. As such, there exists also an incentive for you to make yourself financially independent, to set up a life for yourself beyond and outside of your marriage, to make a rational...
A judge dropped. A judge dropped. Steph. I think a judge dropped.
Should I wait?
Yeah, I think the judge might have dropped. Yeah, they've joined back.
Hi, I'm so sorry to do this. I'm just going to switch from my Wi-Fi to my data just to make sure that that doesn't happen again. I'm really sorry. Give me 2 seconds. Just for reference, I stopped the timer at 4 minutes and 30 seconds, but I'll chat. Okay, I'm really sorry again about that. Can I just get confirmation that everyone can hear and see me? Yes, fantastic. Speaker, again, I'm so sorry about that. I really do apologize. Thank you for bearing with me. It shouldn't happen again now that I'm on data. I stopped you at 4 minutes and 31 seconds. You were making the point about marriages becoming more realistic and the impacts that has. Would you mind just continuing from that point?
Yeah, okay, cool.
Again, thank you so much. I'm really sorry about that.
Okay, it's fine. The second thing that happens on our side of the house is that people also make better decisions within their marriage. In their initial years of marriage, people understand that it is normal and expected for them to fall apart in 10 years because that is literally what is stated by the government. As such, there exists an incentive for you as well to make yourself financially independent, to set up a life for yourself, to make a rational contingency plan knowing that you will be out likely of this marriage in 10 years. Therefore, in instances in which you want to leave your marriage and end up leaving your marriage, it is far easier to leave because you already have built a life for yourself outside of this marriage because you are financially independent and because you entered it in the initial stages knowing that you were going to leave it likely. But thirdly, the state is also likely to make leaving your marriage easier. Creating this law, the government will have to anticipate the fact that more people on our side than before will leave their marriage in 10 years after their contract expires. And as such, when marriages happen, for example, they will create more ways for you to categorize finances independently, more ways when you have a child to decide who will end up having this child instead of leaving it all up to a lengthy legal battle at the end of this marriage. Divorce is becoming less messy is good for a couple of intuitive reasons. You no longer have the court battles sucking up times and funds when people do get divorced on our side of the house. You also don't have to put your children through months of living hell because everything is clean and quick, given the government by making this law already anticipates a system in which people are going to get divorced. The fourth thing that changes is we also change the way people think about their marriages. There comes a point in most marriages where people inevitably realize that they become incompatible. But as humans, it is all too easy to stay in the habit of what we've already been doing, where even if you know that it is no longer the same, you simply wait to try again for 2 more years, to overstretch yourself in this marriage more just to make it work. Because marriage seems like an endless run that you have committed to for life. On our side, we provide an ultimatum in 10 years' time, where even if your marriage is going well on the surface, we give you an opportunity to actually sit down and think about whether you truly want to renew this marriage. But fifthly, when you do make the very realistic choice to leave your partner after they have changed, there is also less stigma around divorced people on our side, because likely more people will get divorced given all of these mechanisms I've just talked to you about. It becomes normalized, so when it does happen, there's far less stigma. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
Recognize that not everyone has the possibility to establish an independent lifestyle, especially given people are still probably going to be hopeful of staying with their partners forever.
I think people are hopeful in the status quo because most marriages last for a very long time in the status quo. That changes on our side with all of these mechanisms I've talked to you about. But B, for the people who do not have the opportunity to become financially independent, likely they just won't leave their marriages on either side of the house. That's probably parallel. This is probably a debate about fully consenting partners who have good opportunities. Second argument, why it is better on our side for women. The first reason is because you feel less guilty when you leave relationships, given that stigma goes away. The second is you're also less likely to agree to become a housewife in the first place. Many women in the status quo are influenced by their husbands to become housewives. They are easily promised financial dependence for the rest of their lives because of the way marriages work. And they are guilt-tripped into taking your place within the marriage because marriages in the status quo are seen as something that lasts for life. Women on our side are more likely to push back against their husbands because the idea of giving up your life's career for a 10-year relationship is far harder to persuade women into. And as such, more women are likely to be willing to seek divorces and less likely to agree to become a housewife. So for all of these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to propose.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, that speaker, and well done. And thank you again for bearing with the technical difficulties, much appreciated. Could I just get like a thumbs up from my panelists if they are ready for us to continue? Yeah. Cool. All right, fantastic. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the first speaker from opposition to open that side's case.
Can I confirm that I'm visible and audible?
And hear and see you loud and clear.
Great. Just a reminder to team proposition. I would like verbal POIs. I cannot guarantee to see chat or video. With that in mind, I'll just really quickly organize my papers and begin my speech. All right, assuming the panel is ready. 3, 2, 1. Panel, when proposition characterizes this debate as primarily impacting ones that are in perfectly consensual relationships that have an equal idea of falling apart, we don't see how they get any sort of substantive benefits. As insofar as consensual divorce by both partners is A, likely to be clean in the status quo, as there is no need to fight a legal battle because you have the ability to agree on things. And I think B, it is also not frowned upon insofar as it doesn't take an extensive legal battle. Notice then that in instances where it is frowned upon, it is likely that exiting the relationship would also be frowned upon. I don't think proposition does enough legwork to analyze as to why the concept of marriage isn't going to be idealized nor by society nor people on their side of the house. I think the only change they can claim is people are unable to see marriage as the permanent concept. And I tell you that this is inherently harmful by taking away people's ability to feel secure and, more importantly, people's ability to genuinely be secure within relationships. More elaboration on that in constructive. I want to do 3 things in the speech. 1, a few good points of nuanced frame on the debate. 2, responses to proposition case before forwarding our own constructive. 1, on how permanent marriage inherently is more likely to guarantee safety in relationships. And 2, how divorce is a better mechanism of opting out and thus, on our side of the house, more accessible and allows more people to opt out of relationships from which they may want to opt out. A few good points of frame before I move on to responses. Okay, panel, I think there's one thing you need to realize, that the amount of agency people have in a lot of relationship is really, really minimal. That is to say, there are many people, I think proposition to an extent concedes this, that are simply unable to leave relationships because of many factors. This is something that you really have to consider. I think the same applies for people's ability to establish independent lifestyles outside relationships. Thus, it is important to understand that the scope of impacts coming from prop are going to be really, really small, if any, because proposition doesn't actually allow the vast majority of people to exit relationships. I think the only impact is on a very narrow amount of relationships that are exited consensually and that have an equal share of power. I think for such relationships, in the status quo, divorce is a very viable mechanism and one that clearly works. I think the problematic area that you have to be discussing is relationships where the amount of power shared is not exactly symmetrical. I'm going to analyze in our constructive why we benefit these people on our side of the house. But I want to just characterize the current trend around divorce and how that is likely to change on proposition, because they tell you that but you can still get divorce on our side of the house. I think in the status quo, divorce is becoming more accessible. I think there are 2 crucial reasons to this. 1, people gradually accept that marriage may not be as sacred as it potentially is, and thus the amount of consent people have in it is important. But I think 2, because marriage is a permanent concept and perceived as such by individuals and society, it is likely to have a very strong push for normalizing divorce. divorce for making it more accessible, because people don't see an alternative. I think when you limit marriage to contracts expiring in 10 years, two things are likely to happen. One, you get a significantly smaller push and an incentive for governments to change structures to facilitate divorce. I think that is because there is an anyways expiration period and everything is going to be based around that. I think all of their constructive when they tell you about how governments are going to make it easier for you to get out of relationships. This applies assuming you're getting out of the relationship based on your contract rather than trying to leave a relationship from one side or rather than trying to leave a relationship before this contract runs out. But then secondly, they have significantly more stigma about leaving relationships before the expiration date. Because you have an expiration date, it is really likely that people are just going to tell you to wait, or you might fix things up before the contract runs out. I think this removes the sense of urgency in relationships. I'm going to impact on why that is important in people who are in problematic relationships later on. A few good points of response to prop case. One, they tell you about how you're more likely to get better interpersonal relationships. Two, how it's likely to be better for women insofar as they don't opt into being housewives. A few quick points of response on interpersonal relationships. One, they tell you people are going to be more sensible on how they opt into the system because they're more likely to acknowledge that this is likely to fail. This brings benefits such as accustoming for when the divorce happens. Panel, I think one, when both parties are able to agree that they want to fall apart, people are able to accustom their lifestyles. I think two, once entering into a divorce, acknowledging that divorce is once entering into marriage, acknowledging that they might want to leave the marriage, are probably also accustoming for life in the future. But I think really importantly, proposition doesn't show you why a 10-year contract means an individual is not going to be hopeful about the relationship. Notice, I think when you're entering a relationship and you're in the honeymoon phase, as proposition describes, you're unlikely to constructively think about the fact that this relationship is likely to fall apart. I think you and your partner's ideas are going to be that you are going to renew these contracts. And if anything, it is a symmetric amount of understanding that people are able to have about the facts that these relationships are unlikely to be permanent in the vast majority of cases. On your second constructive about how people opt into being housewives, before that, I can take prop.
If the characterization you write on is the increasing liberalizing trend where marriage is seen as less sacred, don't we accelerate that process on our side of the house when marriage doesn't become a permanent commitment?
Look, I think the importance of marriage is not its sacredness and your inability to opt out. I think the importance of marriage is that it is a legally binding commitment that, if anything, can only be broken insofar as A, both parties consent, or B, you have a legal procedure to break it. I think this is the important part, not ideas that marriages are to be held forever. We don't believe that people should stay in abusive relationships. We just believe insofar as marriage becomes something temporary, it is significantly worse for people within them. I'm going to elaborate on that in a constructive. But another point about how people don't opt into being housewives, because they're unlikely to believe that the support is going to stay forever. Panel, I think this disregards a large portion of people that are still likely to do so because they need the financial dependence. I think, if anything, this point gives these people less stability. I think when your partner is able to leave you, although you're likely to be greatly financially dependent on them, this diminishes the amount of safety you have the ability to feel in a relationship. And that takes me directly into first constructive point from opposition. I'm going to integrate some rebuttal to that in here. Why is permanent marriage more likely to guarantee safety in relationships? Panel, I think for many people, marriage is the primary way through which they're able to get security and stability. I think this also impacts onto places where the power in relationship is not evenly shared. I think in instances where the woman is fully financially dependent on the man and has no ability to anyhow change that, specifically in these instances, it is important that relationships and marriages are legally binding and long-term. Why? One, on proposition, you don't have the ability to escape from these relationships as a woman, regardless. I think you don't have enough power to be able to opt out of this contract insofar as you're financially dependent. But I think what they crucially allow the man to do is leave you insofar as he becomes dissatisfied, insofar as you become sick, insofar as there's any circumstances that change that are likely to change. I think they greatly diminish the ability of people to feel safe in relationships. Notice, this is a very strong impact insofar as many people in the status quo are dependent on their significant other and are unable to change them. Notice, I think many people find comfort in relationships and marriages being seen as something long-term. I think only insofar as relationships are long-term are you able to feel safe, but you're also able to factually be safe insofar as you're dependent on your significant other. I think this is a significant group of stakeholders that proposition just doesn't engage with. Second, constructive on how divorce is a better mechanism of opting out. I already explained why we're more likely to have divorce, and why it's more likely to be destigmatized, but why is it a better mechanism of escaping relationships? I think two layers of analysis here. One, you have significantly more power. Why is this important? Why is this true? Panel, I think when you leave for a legal process, you're significantly more able to reap the benefits of a divorce. Notice, divorce systems oftentimes, in fact, do favor women when they're getting divorced. I think moreover, you're able to get an amount of money, you're able able to get some property, you're able to prosecute the other individual. I think you're able to get them to pay like child support. This not only relates to the safety, but this also increases the ability of people to opt out of relationships. Specifically in instances where there's a power disbalance regarding finance or something else, you're unable to opt out in the instance where it's just a contract that breaks apart because you're financially dependent on the other person. But then it's first you're able to get a divorce and guarantee that a sum of money is to be paid to you, you're more likely to have an ability to establish an independent life for yourself. Panel, why do you vote for opposition? I think one, because we provide safety and security to people in relationships by maintaining the narrative that this is something long-term. But then secondly, because our mechanisms of escape are significantly easier and more catering to people who are in problematic relationships with a power disbalance. Never prouder to oppose.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and well done to that speaker. I'd now like just to get like thumbs up from my panelists that they're ready to continue. Fantastic. I'd like to now welcome the second speaker from the proposition to continue that side's case. Yeah.
Hi, am I audible?
Loud and clear.
Unhappy marriages should not be life sentences. And for that reason, on proposition, we want marriage sentences and marriages that last in blocks of 10 years. Before going on to the two questions, one other thing I want to point out about the opposition case. Ops first makes a big misconception about our case, right? We're not arguing for individuals where both parties are perfectly consenting into ending a relationship. Because in that circumstance, that's probably just like a regular happy divorce, right? That is likely parallel. We're talking about circumstances where one individual wants to leave, but in general is unable to leave, or the other individual has coercive action or other societal elements coerce them into not leaving. Those are the instances where divorce is necessary and these mechanisms are necessary, right? Like if both sides really do want to leave, there probably is no debate there because any mechanisms will probably be amicably resolved. So that's what the debate is actually about. And that's what we believe that this renewal system in our mechanism where both individuals have to consent to renewing is absolutely crucial. So they didn't really listen to a lot of our mechanization. With that said, two questions. One, on unsuccessful relationships and how they play out. And secondly, on the quality of relationships. One, what happens during unsuccessful relationships? Three questions. First, on the principal engagement, they had no response here whatsoever, right? I think this is already a big problem for their case because if we're able to prove why the idea of marriage on a principal level, it is illegitimate for you as an individual to consent to this lifelong commitment where you have no idea of knowing how the other individual will be like 30 years down the line. We can prove on marriages in general are illegitimate. They say marriages are just like, entering a contract, right? Just legal ideas. Yes, but when you enter a legal contract, you need to be an informed individual to actually be able to consent into that contract. That is why coercive contracts that lie to you and like on a surface basis are not allowed in the status quo. So therefore, if we're able to prove this principle to return no response, the second absolutely needs to respond to this, we're still able to directly win the principle clash of why it's illegitimate to have these contracts. So we already have that big advantage on our side. Secondly, what they actually engage with. On the process of divorce, we told you how we in general make like the leading process a lot easier because there are government structures. Over here on their side was saying, if you choose to have renewals of marriages, you would also not have actual structures help divorce. I'm going to flip this, right? Because listen to their own analysis. They say on their side, people enter marriages with the idea that this will be a lifelong idea. Notice that as a base premise of their entire argument on feeling secure. It's the idea that you spend the rest of the life with this person. For that very reason, there's a lack of incentive on their side and a lack of societal narrative to place emphasis on divorce, because that is when divorce is seen as like a secondary option, seen as something that's wrong and illegitimate because you're supposed to spend your rest of the life with this other individual. On our side, there's a crucial narrative shift because the moment you enter in the very first place, you're only consenting for 10 years. You're not acknowledging this is a lifelong commitment. So for that reason, other structures like divorce, the idea that it's okay to leave earlier, or it's even normal in some instances to leave a marriage earlier, becomes far more normalized in the legal system and the societal level. So on our side, we're much more likely to have better divorce structures. But secondly, notice a problem with the comparative. They're arguing for the status quo, right? In the status quo, structured divorce are already extremely problematic in general, like custody battles, things like fighting for actual rights, like resources, are already extremely complex processes. That's what they're actually defending. So the idea that it'll gradually get better is probably untrue, and that if we just look at the status quo, there are a lot of problems. On our side, we also give you a unique mechanism, right? We told you on our side, once again, when divorces become more normal in that like the contracts end in 10 years, there's also incentive for governments to have far more improvement in terms of structures of actually ending these relationships, as it has become a normal and integral process of marriage in the very first place. Before I go on, I'll take a POI.
Notice that exactly these structures are things that protect women from being ditched in relationships where they have a power disparity.
Okay, I'll talk more about women specifically in the second class, but we can quickly deal with that here, right? And that they say in the instance of divorce, on their side, divorce protects them. One, we gave you mechanistic reasons why we get more structures on our side. No response whatsoever, right? That probably also means things like better prenups and resource allocation. Secondly, they can see these instances where women are relatively weak in terms of economic resources. That is why unique problems in the status quo, where there are long drawn-out court battles for things like custody, become extremely problematic. If there is a large power imbalance, the man will probably coerce the woman into signing a prenup, into having these long legal battles that it's very difficult for women to win. If they don't have resources, it's extremely difficult for you to succeed right now in the status quo. On our comparative, we're likely to have better structures the moment it becomes normalized that you actually end these relationships. So make those a lot better on our side. So when it comes to vulnerable women, if there is a power imbalance, that will get abused on their side. They're protected on our side. 3, on reduced stigma. This is crucially important, right? We had very little response to their side. They kind of just say, divorces exist, right? The problem we told you crucially to return no response for is that when you divorce, you are ending a contract prematurely. So in that instance, it looks like you are breaking an idea and breaking a promise that will stay together for the rest of our lives. On our side, it becomes far more normalized and legitimate for you to end these relationships when the idea is in 10 years, we'll renew it or we won't renew it. It works out or it doesn't work out. The reason this is crucially important is because it makes it much easier for women to leave relationships. One, in the extreme cases where you're in an abusive relationship and it's just extremely difficult to leave because of societal pressures, you don't have a way to actually get out. So in extreme instances, in a very traditional countries where it's difficult to leave marriages, that's a crucial mechanism. But in most of the other cases, you also reduce the stigma because now on a societal level, on a marriage, for example, you just say, I'll be together for the next 10 years and then we'll see how it goes. On their side, you promise to be with the other individual for the rest of their life. That societal narrative difference makes the biggest difference in this debate because on their side, women are coerced to stay within relationships and within marriages because they feel like they are obliged to by society. No response whatsoever on their side. They don't solve this crucial problem. So on the point of unsuccessful relationships, I think we're able to prove why 1, the structures are better, and 2, it is much easier in instances where you want to leave to actually leave. There's just a lack of engagement on the first in terms of clashing. Now, secondly, on the quality of relationships, 2 things. 1, would women be more independent? We told you multiple reasons. You like to be financially independent and seek employment on an individual basis because you feel like it wouldn't last forever. The response to is quite weak, right? Because they basically just say, oh, you have incentives to kind of do that on either side. I would argue 1, this concedes this is contradictory to their own argument that you feel secure and therefore you don't do those things, right? But secondly, listen to their own analysis once again. We told you that in general, if you feel like you're going to stay with the individual forever, you're reliant upon them. So you're likely to give them things like careers because you feel like this is a very large commitment. So the instances when you actually break up, it's probably far worse, right? Once again, they make very uncomparative arguments. They say the honeymoon phase will still exist to an extent. On the mechanistic level, yes, maybe there still is a honeymoon phase, but you still enter the relationship knowing this is a 10-year contract rather than an entire life of commitment. So you're still less likely to give up things that are very important, like your career, like your finances, etc. So there's necessarily comparative there, right? They're just basically mitigating to very little success. But then, what is their argument? They say safety is important in a relationship. This is a big problem with their case. A few ones of response. 1, listen to their own context, right? If we're talking about a situation where women are extremely vulnerable, there probably isn't a very large comparative there because men hold all the resources. And therefore, if they actually want to get divorced and if they're going to make divorce easier on their side, in the instances where men want to divorce these individual women, it is likely still going to happen, right? They gave no reason to why that's not going to happen on their side, especially if their entire case is about they want to make divorce easier. That's extremely tense in their case already at the very fundamental level. So in instances where women are heavily reliant upon a man, the man has all the financial resources and everything, they're likely still going to divorce. No comparative on their side. But secondly, even if they get a feeling of security, it is unclear to me why that's a good thing. Because maybe in the short term, you feel secure, but then when you actually get divorced, for example, 50% of divorce in the US actually occur, that's a big problem because you are not prepared for it. So if you feel marginally safe in the short term, but you are absolutely screwed over in the long term because you're completely shocked at what's occurring and had no build up towards it in terms of preparing resources, you're likely to be far worse off. So on their side, there are far larger tangible harms when you aren't prepared for divorce and it actually occurs. A quick substantive on increasing the effort in marriage. In the status quo, there's an issue of complacency in marriages where because you think it's a lifelong thing, you're less likely to commit resources into it and you become complacent. This is where relationships actually deteriorate because you put less effort into it and you assume the other individual will always be in your life. On our side, we increase the quality of relationships the moment both men and women feel like they had to put more effort into it because it's not a lifelong thing and therefore they still have to maintain the relationship to a higher degree. Therefore, you get more things like higher quality relationships, more communicating, and therefore better relationships in general. This also means 1, we get less divorces on our side. We're able to retain longer relationships and higher quality relationships. And secondly, both men and women are better off in relationships. There's more communication and it's way healthier. And for that reason, relationships are also significantly better on our side. For all these reasons, vote for the proposition.
Fantastic. Thank you very much and well done to that speaker. Can I just get a thumbs up from the panelists that they are ready to continue? Fantastic. I would now invite the second speaker from the opposition to continue that side's case. Yeah.
Hi, I hope I'm audible. Okay. Great. Because the panel is ready, just before I start, I would like my POIs to be verbal. And without further ado, I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Notice that toxic narratives exist at the point of which you exit a relationship without strings attached. At the point of which you make a relationship able to embody basically nothing outside of proposition. They make it a no strings attached relationship. 2 things I'll do in my speech today. Firstly, I'll go through some general points of rebuttal, and then secondly, present you the last constructive on our side of the house, which directly clashes with their constructive, which is talking about higher quality relationships. But notice, before that, let's move on to rebuttal. Firstly, let's still engage somewhat to the constructive that they bring out in their third. Notice that they talk about how this is no longer a lifelong thing. So meaning that you're more likely to put effort in because it's 10 years, it's a short-term contract, and that because you're going to talk more, communicate more, and yada, yada. Notice that that is simply false. At the point at which you know that after 10 years, you can just dissolve it at any time you want, you're pretty much going to put no effort in it whatsoever. At the point of which this has no strings attached to you, what harm are you going to get from completely ruining the relationship or the other side? Notice that the comparative is that you cannot take that risk. You cannot take that big assertion and leap of harming the other side because there are repercussions. Because someone finally has the power to take back what you took away from you. And by that is divorce, because you need a healthy relationship to not lose your assets or to not be put into court. And notice it's exactly those things on our side of the house which empower women and give them the possibility to live a better life. And note on their argument, this completely falls into the water at the point at which you're able to completely move around it with no strings attached. But secondly, let's talk about the toxic relationships that they build on their side of the house. And this directly stems from this constructive, because notice that why would you do anything at the point of which you know that you can just move around freely? This means that the financial individualism that happens on their side of the house, it's more likely at the end of the day. Because notice we all know Jim and Pam from The Office. And notice this is the side of proposition lives in, because Jim does whatever he wants. He buys a house, he makes a job in Philadelphia, leaving Pam out of it, and becomes financially stable on his own. And this is exactly what happens on proposition, because you live in a world where you don't have these strings attached, leaving the woman completely alone. And this is more likely to happen exactly on their side at the point at which you allow this power imbalance to happen. Because notice on their side of the house, on a comparative, there's likely to be less repercussion. And this is exactly where it happens on their side of the house. But why is this so? And this is the third layer of response here, because this exactly tackles the structure of how the government works. We say, sure, the government will view things differently, but notice they won't view the structure of divorce differently, but rather exiting a relationship. They'll make it easier to exit a relationship when the contract stops, but they won't make it easier for when the divorce stops. Because note, Stephanie says so in first prop and characterizes it in that way. She says divorce is still amicable, but notice this is a huge shift in their second proposition when they say, oh, well, divorce is equal to contract now. Notice this shift, first of all, on their strategy and plan, which completely makes their team line imbalanced. And secondly, notice how different these two structures are, because divorce is amicably giving power to women at the end of the day, being able to take back assets if they were to have a power imbalance. And notice that this is exactly what on our side of the house, it's more likely to happen. At the point at which divorce is more accessible, at the point at which divorce is more normalized, you're more likely to change the structure of divorce and not the structure of leaving these relationships. And this is exactly on a long-term basis where you have better end offs. Because on the structure of divorce, if you look on a comparative, when you exit a relationship because those 10 years stop, you're not going to owe that person anything, because that's how it's going to work. Because notice, if my wife falls ill, I have no connection to her or strings attached to keep taking care of her. I can just leave because the government made it easy. Second, on a comparative on our side, at the point at which you cannot leave, you still need to take care of that person. Worst case scenario on our side of the house, you will initiate a divorce, but at the point at which this has become accessible, at the point at which this has become normalized, it's more likely that the woman will be still able to get some assets out of this to take care of herself. And notice, this is exclusive on our side of the house because of the structure analysis that we gave you in first off, and now that the structure doesn't change on their house. Now, moving on to my constructive, which is talking about higher quality relationships. Notice you enter a marriage due to the feelings and stability you have towards someone. It's a rare case that you just blindly go in feeling nothing towards them. We admit this. You're more likely to go in where you feel secure, stable, and know that you have a long future or prosperity with this. On a contrary belief, what happens on there? This means this leads to a feather-like step on the relationship, and this exactly clashes with their constructive. Because you're committed to that, you are more likely to discuss things in general terms with a partner before buying a house, before buying a car. Because notice, this is on a long term going to apply to your relationship. On their side of the house, you do not have to care about the long term. You only care about the short term benefits. Because at the point of which all I have to do is just care if my girlfriend loves me for the 10 years, that's all I'm gonna do. Note that. At the point of which, on a long term, I'm more likely to take care of what happens, to grow a family, to have a stability at the end of the day. On the comparative, there are no strings attached. You are more likely to be loose, just like Jim from The Office. Secondly, this builds a negative stereotype and connotation around people. But before I move on, sure, go ahead.
Yeah, why is being short-termist an inherently bad thing? Why is it a bad thing to have multiple romantic partners over the period of a lifetime?
Because it creates a power imbalance on your side of the house. When it's a short-term benefit, you don't care about how the long-term will impact the person. At the point at which you can just simply leave after those 10 years and you know your purse and you know you're financially capable and independent yourself, you're not going to do anything to make the life easier on their side of the house. On a comparative, you still have to take care about those long-term virtues, like making sure that the power imbalance is not too heavy. Notice that moving back to my constructive, that this creates young people more likely to enter these relationships on their side of the house. But why is this so? Notice the characterization of marriage so far. Notice that marriage is seen as sacred, something that you enter if you love someone. Notice that we admit that honeymoon phase still exists. And this goes for a lot of teenagers, especially, oh, I'm so in love, blah, blah, blah. We all had this phase, we know how it is. But on a comparative, who normalizes a toxic relationship more? At the point at which there are no repercussions of structures of being able to completely enter something with no strings attached, or somewhere where you can just amicably leave and have a divorce. But because exactly here, where you go for the long haul, you go for commitment, you go for transparency, where you're less likely to enter a relationship like this. On their side of the house, teenagers will more likely see it as something they can just do because in 10 years, they can just leave it with no strings attached. And it doesn't even have to be a consensus decision. This is exactly the problematic stereotype that's going to happen on their side of the house. And when this happens, it's to build a toxic narrative when it comes to the portrayal of emotion and love. This is why you vote down the government.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and well done to that speaker. Can I just get a thumbs up from my panelists when they're ready? Fantastic. I'd like to now welcome the third speaker from the proposition to continue that side's case. Here.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
I can see and hear you loud and clear.
Okay, great, fantastic. Okay, I'll start. Two things to note at the offset of my speech. First, this debate is not about extremes. It is not about extremely happy marriages because on our house, people just extend them. Similarly, this debate isn't about extremely abusive marriages either. Why? Three reasons. One, they probably can't access divorce on their side of the house either, right? Because in order to get divorced, you need a lawyer in order to present arguments as to why you should owe a certain part of the assets. You need to go through that court proceeding. So the women have so little power, they probably can't afford that divorce either. But second, if their mechanism is men have so much power that they will literally ditch your wives, even if they're still married on their side of the house, men can still ditch their wives. They can still cheat on their wives. They can still not provide for their wives because, like they say themselves, the wives have no power in that situation. So even if they're married on their side of the house, you can still cheat on them. You can still do a bunch of other things. But three, they have very conflicting characterizations here, right? Because on one hand, these women are so powerless that the moment a man decides to leave them after 10 years, they'll be poor. But on the other hand, these women are wealthy enough to get a divorce and are able to afford that process. Both things cannot be true. Therefore, this debate isn't about extremes, and instead it is about couples in the middle. This debate isn't about abusive marriages, but unhappy marriages. This debate isn't about people in Islamic countries where they are forced into marriages at the age of 14, but rather people who respond when being pushed and pulled by societal pressures. The second thing I want to note at the top is their comparative in this debate is very iffy because they said they can support divorces. One, there's a conflicting characterization because on one hand, they want permanent marriages. They want to promote the idea and the security that marriage should be permanent. If that is the case, then the stigmatization of divorce still continues on this house because people are seen to be breaking that permanent commitment that they themselves value so much on their side. But second, if you want to talk about the normalization of divorce, we accelerate that process because they themselves can see that divorce is being normalized in the status quo because people are seeing marriage as less sacred. We accelerate that process when we're literally signing contracts where marriage being a short-term commitment instead of an indefinite sacred commitment. But third, it's unclear why divorce gets easier on their side because they just say the state will provide more resources. Like the state probably isn't providing that much resources on either side of the house, right? Divorce is a civil issue. It isn't something that the state usually gets involved in on either side of the house. With that in mind, then two things. One, on the indefinite length of marriage, on the quality of marriage, and second, on the vulnerable parties within the marriage. First, let's talk about marriages in general. Their big push under this clash is that you get a feeling of security, the point at which marriage is permanent. Three responses. One, it is unclear as to how much benefits people derive from this feeling of security. It's unclear as to why the feeling of security is what makes me happy. That probably isn't what makes me happy. What makes me happy is doing things with my partner. What makes me happy is going on vacation. What makes me happy is having sex with them. Like, I don't know why the feeling of security leads to so much happiness and such a big impact on their side of the house. But second, we told you that the feeling of security on their side was a false sense of security. There were two reasons why. One, people change over time. The person you marry at 25 is not the same person at 45. So even if you feel secure when you're 25, that security is a false one insofar as like you don't feel that happy about them anymore 10 years down the line. But second, we also told you about the honeymoon phase, right? How over time, many marriages are likely to diminish because over time you see the flaws, you see the more monotonous aspects of being in a relationship and the initial experiment expires. Therefore, even if people feel an initial sense of security, that security is fickle, that security is fleeting. But third, we also told you that if they say people feel a sense of security and that sense of security is exclusive to their side of the house, we told you that this sense of security had active harms because it compelled people to make decisions which created a sense of dependency. When you feel secure on their side of the house, and if you truly feel secure, that is when you are less likely to disagree to becoming financially dependent on your partner. You are more likely to agree to quit your job and decide to raise children instead because you feel as if and you feel that sense of security, which is what they're arguing for on their side of the house. The problem, though, is that many of these decisions that people make on their sense of security are simply irreversible ones. It is hard to get a job again if you decide to quit the job out of a sense of security. That is why the sense of security on this house was so harmful and trap people into terrible marriages. What was the comparative on our side of the house? We told you that when marriages weren't permanent, sure, you lose that sense of security, but it also meant that you would not make irreversible sacrifices, which made you dependent on your partner if you did not feel as if this marriage would last forever. Their only responses is, people will just have incredibly short-term relationships because they think as if there are no strings attached. Therefore, you don't care about your marriage. One, presumably you also want to be happy, right? Because you want to be happy, you still have an incentive to care about your marriage. You still have an incentive to care about your partner. You still have an incentive to treat them well. But two, people just like their partners, right? So like we think even if there aren't strings attached, it's still likely to be a happy marriage. People are still likely to try. But furthermore, we think people are likely to try harder on our side of the house. Why? Because on their side of the house, when marriage is seen as a lifelong commitment, that is when after you tie the knot, you don't have to try anymore, right? Whereas on our side of the house, if your marriage is subject to constant renewal, that's when you have to try to appease your partner, right? That's when you have to try to make them happy, or else they will not renew the contract. What we told you then is that people will less likely make these irreversible decisions. Lastly, they don't deal with a lot of arguments we make in our first speech. We told you how in there's a house, people are stuck in a negative cycle. That when people are unhappy in a marriage, they say, let's just try 2 more years. Maybe I'm not trying hard enough. Because you promote the narrative that marriage is permanent and indefinite, that is when people say, maybe I should just try harder. Maybe I should give it a year or 2 more. That is when people are stuck in an endless cycle. That is when 10 years flashes by and your marriage is still unhappy. That is when you cannot leave your marriage because you're too old to do so and you've become too dependent on your partner. They also don't respond to our argument about how people cannot meaningfully consent to a permanent relationship. Even if people can be committed to each other in an abstract sense, that commitment does not manifest when you and your partner both change. Let's take them at their absolute best. Let's say that people are incredibly short-termist, and let's say that people do not care about the long-term stability of their marriage. That is their best case scenario and their highest impact. It is unclear as to why being short-termist is a bad thing. In the long term, we are all dead. In the short term, you can be happy. In the short term, you can have sex. In the short term, you can try new things with new partners who have different personalities. So to the extent that is true, we think it is good to be short-termist, right? We think it is good to have multiple romantic partners and to experience like different relationships and different personalities and like be able to mingle and have different life experiences. Right? We think life isn't about like sacrificing yourself for some iffy notion of long-term stability. Life is about happiness in the short term because long-term, nothing is guaranteed. So you might as well just be happy in the short term. Unclear why being short-term is that bad of a thing. Second, on women and vulnerable minorities. Before that, yes.
Notice that people which want to just have fun in the short run are unlikely to opt into relationships insofar as they're going to like date people and not necessarily opt into these structures.
No, we think that like you're able to have like a balance of 2 on our side of the house, right? On your side of the house, you force people to make a choice. Either you're short-term for the rest of your life and have a series of girlfriends, or you're long-term for the rest of your life. You force people to make an extreme choice, either a permanent commitment or no commitment. On our side of the house, you get something in the middle, right? That you can have a short-term commitment that is subject to renewal. Therefore, on our side of the house, we give people more agency when you allow people to choose into that middle ground. Second, on women and vulnerable minorities, what happens down on their side of the house? The first thing we told you is that divorce is not unique. So if they want to talk about divorce can also happen on our side of the house as well, right? To the extent that divorce is just breaking a contract. So it's unclear what the unique benefit of divorce is on their side of the house. If it's about splitting assets, on our side of the house as well. But even in your best case scenario, even this debate is a comparison between divorce and your marriage ending after 10 years. We think your marriage ending after 10 years is better than divorce. 1, there's more stigma to divorce and leaving your partner on their house in general because you're seen as the exception. Divorce is breaking a commitment. Divorce is breaking a promise. On our house, you're not breaking a promise. The promise has just ended. Therefore, you're less likely to be seen as undesirable. You're less likely to be seen as lacking credibility. This is why in the status quo, when people get divorced, they cannot find new partners because of that stigma. We get rid of that stigma to a huge extent on our house when the commitment is not permanent to begin with. For these reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Fantastic. Thank you very much and well done to that speaker. Can I just get a thumbs up from my panelists that they are ready to go? Cool. Fantastic. I would now like to welcome the third speaker from opposition to continue their side's case. Yeah.
Hi, I would prefer verbal POIs from the side of a proposition if that's possible. And may I begin? I'll take that as a yes.
Whenever you're ready, go for it.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think proposition needs to make it clear about what cases this debate is about, because in first and third, they want to make it about this like perfect or like middle relationships, but in second they talk like a whole bunch about how this is also about abusive relationships, how we get it better. I think what I'll do in my speech is I'll talk how mainly this is about relationships in the middle, but some of those relationships in the middle also have a lot of power disparity, specifically where women are a very vulnerable stakeholder, which is why I also prove to you why we have women better off on our side of the house. Few things I want to clear up before moving to 3 clashes. Firstly, I want to prove to you that we increase the ability of people to consent to relationships. Secondly, secondly, that we get women better off, and thirdly, that we overall just get better relationships. But I think this is a minor clash because I think good relationships can exist on both sides of the house. Firstly, then, a few things to clear up. Firstly, I think that divorce on our side of the house becomes significantly easier for three structural reasons. One, we normalize the idea of divorce rather than normalizing the idea of like simply leaving out of marriage after 3 years. Secondly, the state has more of the incentive on their side of the house to simply make it very easy for people to leave after 10 years. Rather than leaving after like at any possible point. I think at the status quo, we see a lot of the trend for people pushing specifically for like for the state allowing for the divorce to be cheaper, for allowing lawyers to be more accessible, for allowing it to last less time and things like that. Thirdly, I think there's a lot of push in the general society for the divorce being normalized as it is, and simply for the divorce to become easier. This push will significantly decrease, and it will be very much harder to convince for divorce to become easier at the point of which you don't see divorce as something that is very much crucial, and only people who are opting into it are the ones that really need to leave the relationships. But rather, you see divorce as something that those are the people that cannot wait for 10 years, cannot try to fix their relationships and things like that. This is why I think on our side of the house, divorce a priori becomes a lot easier. This is what I wanted to clear up. 3 questions then. Firstly, on the idea of consent. What I'm doing in this clash is at the worst case scenario for our side of the house, I want to wash out the idea of consent so it's equal on both sides of the house. But the best case scenario for our side of the house, we simply increase the idea of consent and also take the clash that the side of proposition tries to win. What does the side of proposition tell you? They tell you that they have more ability to consent because in the status quo you cannot meaningfully consent to the relationships. The first thing I want to say is they do have a lot of reasons why you need to increase the consent because in status quo you're changing. But 10 years is a very arbitrary metric on at what point you're going to change. They tell you that the honeymoon phase lasts for like 2 years or so, but why is then 10 years is the point when you need the renewal of the contract? This is the amount of the years that you need to consent should be like any point. This means that we should simply make divorce a lot more for our side of the house. We uniquely get this because we get divorced and stigmatized. And the question of this debate is which side allows people to exit the relationships that are very much problematic, therefore increase their idea of consent, the point at which divorce becomes easier for the one side that is doing that. I already proven you by increasing the idea of consent, but briefly want to characterize that they make it far more stigmatized at the point at which you're like now forced to push like forward through the marriage because it's like only 10 years you need to get through. Contract that only lasts for 10 marriage, it's not permanent. You should not be able to like get out at any possible point. The second thing I want to say about the consent, the second thing they tell you is that consent is going to increase simply because you're able to exit at the 10 years and things like that. This is factually incorrect because in 10 years, some people are not going to be able to exit. This is simply because the societal stigma about marriage or societal perception about marriage will not change to such an extent. The long-term relationships will still be glorified. You will still be like very much glorified to stay in the relationship and continue it forward for another 10 years and another 10 years. But families, by things like that, because I think that we value like the idea of long-term marriages as something that is very crucial. I don't think that the proposition doesn't like work to prove to you that the idea of marriage is going to inherently change or idea about long-term relationships is going to inherently change. The second thing I think proposition proves is that there is no pressure for your partner that you're going to be able to stay, because now it's that when the 10-year renewal comes, your partner can simply tell you, come on, we can work through this, we can get another 10 years, we can fix all of the problems that we have and things like that. You can convince the other partner to stay in this. Therefore, I don't think that you a priori have more consent at the point to which the 10-year renewal exists. This means that at the point to which you decrease the consent specifically because you harden the divorce mechanism on the side of proposition, I think we'll get more consent on the side of opposition. The second question I want to talk about is where women are better off. Values clash very highly because women are often the more vulnerable stakeholder when it comes to relationships and things like that. Three things that proposition tells you. One, that it's very much easier to leave. Secondly, that it's more likely to be that they're financially dependent. And thirdly, that it's less likely for them to become high spice. I think that I only also engage by not easier for them to leave. But the second two problems is that it's simply not applying to a large majority of cases, because a large majority of cases are the first proposition speaker characterized. If you're financially not dependent, if you're financially dependent on a person, if you're a housewife, this actually wasn't your choice. You were at least somewhat pressured into this specific idea by your partner. This can equally happen at the point at which it's a 10-year contract, and you're likely going to be forced in the same situation where you're economically dependent on your partner, when you're forced to be housewife, when you're forced to be at home and stay for your children. The thing that we change on our side of the house, and the proposition cannot claim, is that firstly, we have the divorce that is far easier on our side of the house, and this is crucial because at the point at which relation of a power disparity, even if those means that this power disparity is little, or this means that the power disparity is huge, divorce is a legal mechanism that guarantees women that they're going to get something out of their partner. This can mean certain amounts of assets, this can mean certain dependent on their partner. The second thing women uniquely get on our side of the house is the feeling of security. And I think proposition largely mischaracterizes where this feeling of security comes from. This doesn't only come from the feeling of marriage being a permanent thing. This also comes from the fact that you have divorce to rely on as a legal mechanism that is going to guarantee that you're having certain amounts of rights coming back to you, certain amounts of assets coming back to you, certain amounts of money that you're able to get off of. This means that on our side of the house, women are going to be feeling far more secure because they know that either their partner is going to stay with them forever, meaning be with them or they're laying in a hospital bed, or they're having cancer or things like that. Be there when they're in a very weak and vulnerable position, when they're in the worst position of their life, meaning or they know that they're going to get certain amounts of money, that they're going to get certain rights and legal mechanisms. Better than you not knowing that you can have a little less of a chance of being a housewife. This means that women are uniquely better off on our side of the house before entering the third class yes to the POI.
Let's say in your best case scenario, you prove you're comparative and divorce on your side of the house is a lot easy. If divorce is so easy, how do people feel that sense of security, which you argue in your first argument?
Because in divorce, you're uniquely getting certain things out of the relationship. Because on your side of the house, you're not getting those things out of the relationship. When you prove to you that men are also going to equally become financially independent as women are supposed to become financially independent, the men can simply go out of the relationships and take uniquely everything. This means that women get nothing out of the relationship. This is something that is so bad that puts women in a more vulnerable position than they are in the status quo. Third question, very quickly, I don't think it's so important because we increase the quality of the relationship. The thing that proposition fails to engage with is that one, people will consider more when whether you're going to step into a long-term relationship or not. As David points out in a POI, dating exists. If you simply want to have fun in the short term, why would you date? Why would you have in a 10-year marriage contract to be happy? You can simply date a person for 10 years and then switch on. Why uniquely a 10-year marriage contract is such a mechanism for making those people be inherently happy. I think that on our side of the house, people are going to form a meaningful connection because they're going to reconsider whether they actually want to marry the person or not. Because if they're going to face the mechanism of divorce is going to be inherently messy for them, and they're going to want to make the relationship work. They're going to try to fix the relationship, connect more, talk more, all of the things that proposition wants to claim, get more of them on our side of the house. This means that for an average individual, you increase the quality of the relationship, which is good for a large amount of people, which is also why we went on this clash specifically, which is why I vote for opposition.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and well done to that speaker. Can I just get confirmation from my two panelists that we're ready to get going with? Fantastic. Then without further ado, I'd like to welcome the opposition reply to close off that bench's side of the case. Here.
Can I just confirm that I'm visible and audible? Great. With that in mind, assuming the panel is ready, my speech begins in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I just want to make it really clear that proposition is not to win this debate when they tell you this is about couples that consent to break apart because they feel like the relationship isn't working out and they would be better off on their own. Why is that so? Because I think there exists mechanisms in the status quo that are perfectly accepted for people to break apart in the cases where there is no power disparity and people are able to do so. Thus, I think this debate is to be weighed most highly on which side of the house is able to provide stability and safety to people in instances where relationships are not perfect and have a power disbalance. Notice, I'm not talking about absolutes where a woman is literally abused and has zero agency. I think you're more talking about instances where a woman is somewhat financially dependent on their husband and has no ability to change that because of societal structures, because of the way the woman's life has been centered. And I think this is unlikely to change on either side of the house. With that in mind, 3 important questions. Why do you vote for opposition? 1, I think, where do you have a better way of opting out? Panel, I think here you have to compare this. On our side of the house, divorce is likely to become marginally more accessible than on theirs because, look, I think you have a significantly stronger push for it. I think people have significantly less to say as to why it shouldn't be a thing. Proposition responds to this with, but we have better mechanisms that facilitate falling apart because it is something that is normalized in society. Panel, I think exactly because it is normalized to fall apart after 10 years, you have no ability to opt out from relationships in the very moment. Notice, 10 years is not an insignificant period of time. We believe that A, it is better for agency of individuals, and I think B, it is better for safety and security of individuals to be able to opt out in the very moment. But I think secondly, it's really, really important that this happens through a legal procedure. Because notice, when you're talking about instances where a power disbalance exists, people are significantly less likely to exit relationships from which they get no legal guarantees. I think women aren't able to exit relationships where they have a degree of financial dependence on their husbands in instances where they're not going to be paid when they exit these relationships. I think they cannot exit relationships in which they have children if they cannot guarantee that child support is to be paid. In specifically these instances, we guarantee that these people have the ability to opt out of relationships in significantly better ways. Secondly, on safety when you're within the relationship. And notice, this doesn't hinge on whether divorce is greater or less on our side of the house. I think we just fundamentally tell you that people are better off when they have a safety net of a relationship and when one partner is not unable to literally just ditch them with no repercussions. Panel recognize that it is a very big problem that men who have significantly more power in relationships have the ability to leave. I think if a man had a different interpretation of how his family is going to look like, or if he, to quote a proposition, just wants to have fun in this very moment, or if he doesn't feel like taking care of children, he can just leave. On our side of the house, in the worst case scenario for the moment, he has to initiate a divorce in which he's likely to have to pay things such as like child support, in which he's likely to have to pay the women money. I think this is exactly why people in relationships are more safe on our side of the house, because you're able to guarantee that they are to be cared for. Notice, this is a really important stakeholder, because this is a stakeholder propositions fails to help in any regard. There are no benefits that these people can get from these contracts being yearly, as they don't have the ability to exit these relationships due to the power disbalance that exists. However, the contracts endanger them when they're within these relationships, making it less likely that they're able to live a sustainable, being able to live a happy life. Notice further, these aren't always people that can just not center their life around the marriage. Panel, I'm pretty sure if people had the ability to be financially independent, they would in any world prefer that. Proposition cannot frame people as stupid and irrational actors. I think it's simply not an option for the vast majority of people in the status quo. Lastly, on a happier relationship. Proposition there tells you that people are more likely to be considerate, they're more likely to opt out of relationships when they don't feel happy. I think one, when a relationship is just unhappy for both parties, they're likely to opt out through divorce mechanisms, insofar as they both consent to this. But then two, if relationship becomes unhappy from one side, we rather there be somewhat of a safety mechanism that prevents people from ditching these relationships. Lastly, I think when marriages are perceived by people as somewhat long-term, they're more likely to be thoughtful and not enter irrational commitments, nor responses on that from Paul. Ultimately, because we benefit the most marginalized and important stakeholder in this debate, it is why you oppose.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and well done to that speaker, and well done to the opposition bench as a whole. Panelists, are you ready? Fantastic. All right. Then last but not least, I'd like to welcome the proposition reply to close off not only the prop case, but the debate as a whole. Yeah.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you loud and clear. You can start whenever you're ready.
Opposition's case is unbelievably tense at its very core, because the two main ideas they forwarded were, one, there's more security and therefore you are happier in the relationship, and two, we make divorces very easy and that's a better mechanism. And what's even more concerning is that when we point this out, their whip and the reply take completely different stances. The reply opted for, oh, you get something out of the divorce, right? So divorce is easy, and on the comparative, you're able to get some resources. But the reply says, no, divorces are marginally easier, and the most important thing is security. Their case doesn't even know what's going on, and I think in general, it just collapsed on itself. But regardless, 3 points of adjudication. One, on the process of divorce, two things we talked about. Firstly, on the principle, I think the response from third op was really, really late, right? Where they basically said, oh, in general, you don't like, why is 10 years a number, right? We just think 10 years is more reasonable than like a whole lifetime, because you're getting a more reasonable assumption of life, like what's going to happen in 10 years rather than the rest of your life. And therefore, we think it's a fair number. So therefore, we get the principle to pass through, just on the idea that they had a very late response. But secondly, I'm more engaged upon on vulnerable actors. their own characterization makes it a very hard argument for them to win, because it really is about the most vulnerable women who don't have resources to access, like, all sorts of like internal resources, things like expensive court procedures that's unique to divorce, things like, for example, having to like, have men like have all the resources and therefore have all the money in terms of like getting like, things happening, things like prenups being signed, all these different things, all reasons why it's very difficult on their side, right? And if they make divorce easier, all those mechanisms are more likely to happen. So their own analysis of saying like pushing for better divorces is also therefore ineffective. So it's unclear what the action they want to get out of this argument is, right? If the only thing at the very end is that the third speaker says, oh, but you get some resources out of it, right? Because when you divorce, you're able to get things like, for example, money, then it's completely not unique. Because on our side, we have told you why we also have mechanisms to give you money, right? If you sign a contract that ends in 10 years, it's obviously not going to be like the end of the contract, the man gets all the money, right? I thought we made that quite clear at the very start. So the third option says you get marginally more resources, we get all those resources, right? Because we have the similar mechanism. And note the reply was unstrategic here, because if divorce is really just a marginal impact for them, we win this clash extremely easier, because therefore a divorce has very little impact. Both sides have divorce. On our side, we're bringing a unique mechanism on why it's even easier to leave these relationships when you have the mechanism of, for example, being able to end it in 10 years. Therefore, our side wins this clash very, very clearly. Secondly, on stigma, two things. One, opposition never responded to our analysis on why it's important not to have societal stigma to leave relationships. And this is very important because this is the main reason women don't leave relationships, right? They feel that it's wrong to leave. We change that stigma. On their side, they want, marriage to be sacred and long-term. We never had a response to this is a big problem because I told you in general, that is what traps people in unhappy marriages. No response there. But secondly, they say it's bad people just leave relationships after 10 years, right? Once again, they can see, like, they have own concessions to take out their own argumentation. They say there are societal narratives that make you want to stay in long relationships. And also in general, if you love someone when you enter a relationship and it's going quite well after 8 years, there's no real reason for you to leave and not renew it, right? That's just a very intuitive thing on their side. Yes, we can end all coercion, but there's a clear comparative here on why our side is a lot better, because we give you multiple mechanisms to leave. We take away the societal narrative to say you must stay in a long-term marriage for the rest of your life, and therefore women and people in general are better off on our side. So we also went on the point of fixing stigma. 3, on decisions made in relationships. 2 things. 1, on independence. We never heard a further response from the second speaker on the idea of independence, right? So on our side, I think we get also of our impacts of why women are more financially independent and are likely to keep their jobs and commit less to the relationship. This takes out them at their very best, because their biggest impact happens apparently when women are extremely reliant. We have less people who are extremely reliant on a significant other when they enter the relationship with the knowledge that it might not last for the rest of their lives. Therefore, the idea of reliance is a lot better on our side because you have precaution mechanisms. And then, even on our side, they have safety. Let's say the best of safety exists. I don't understand why that's so important, right? Because you gave it away in second and third. If you feel very safe in the short term, I don't know why that's so important. But a real impact is that you feel safe, then you are divorced with or to end the relationship, and therefore you feel very shocked and you're unprepared. Those are much more real and much more harming impacts to the idea of safety. But secondly, you also work harder in relationships, right? We never heard a proper response. We told you when you have a relationship that you have to renew and therefore you have to commit more resources to it, you're likely to try harder. This is important because that means all the mechanisms of, building a better relationship, having a happy relationship are all more likely on our side, and therefore people are happier. They see this as marginal. I think having happy relationships is a very large and widespread impact. And for all these reasons, vote for the problem.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, that speaker. Very well done. And thank you so much to both teams. This was an absolute pleasure. A debate to listen to, very high quality. So congratulations to you both for contributing to that. Panelists, I believe we go to the prep room. Yeah, so we can just go to room 2 prep. Can I just get confirmation from my panelists that they're okay with that? Yeah. Where's my other panelist? Has perhaps already left. Okay, cool. All right. Yeah, I'm gonna start a timer now. We'll see you in 15 minutes.
Thank you for the debate and for judging.
Thank you for judging. And thank you for the debate.
Yeah, sure. Like, go make friends and chat and do all those fun things while you wait.